Mikra Kodesh, a calling of holiness. Okay, that's the holy occasion. It's called a holy time. Mikra Kodesh, calling of holiness. Fine. So we have the introduction of Shabbat. Then we go back to the holidays in verse 4. These are the Lord's appointed holy days, holy occasions, which you shall designate in their appointed times. Which you, Asher Tikru'u Otam, you shall designate them, you shall designate in their appointed time. This is the key idea of what a holiday is. One of the important components of the holiday is that the people decide when the holiday happens. We decide when the holiday happens. Now, you're going to tell me, no, the Torah decides. The Torah told you that on the 15th of Nisan is Passover, and on the 15th of Tishrei is Sukkot, and on the 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah. Yes, of course, God tells you which date, but the Jewish calendar, at least the way it was practiced in biblical times, determining the Jewish calendar is completely in the hands of the people, specifically the court, the high court. And today we have an organized calendar. We're not going to get into the whole history of the calendar, but in biblical times, every month, the new month does not begin until the people saw the new moon. And the people who saw the new moon would have to go to Jerusalem and testify about about sighting the new moon. And when the court investigates them and figures out, yes, you yourselves, you saw the new moon, then they pronounce that day, Rosh Chodesh, day 1 of the month. So if they make a mistake or if they're off a day, it doesn't really matter. They determine when day 1 is. If they determine when day 1 is, then that determines when day 15 is, when the day of Passover is. So today you can open up your calendar and plan Passover vacation for the next year. But in biblical times, you couldn't do that because you didn't really know what day Passover is going to happen. So what the Torah is emphasizing, and that's the verse we showed earlier, what the Torah is emphasizing is while Shabbat is a meeting with God, but we don't determine when Shabbat is. All it says about Shabbat, it says Mikra Kodesh, a holy occasion or calling of holiness. It doesn't say you have to call Shabbat and make it holy. When it comes to the holidays, the Torah says specifically, which you shall designate in their appointed times. The people decide when the holiday is. And why? Because if it's a relationship and it's a mature relationship and a healthy relationship, sometimes who decides when we're going on a date and who decides where we're going to and how we're going to celebrate? So sometimes it's God and sometimes it's the people. Sometimes it's the man, sometimes it's the woman. So the holidays is when we go on the date because God determines that now is a good time. And that's a set time that's not up to the people. Shabbat. But the holidays is up to the people. So that is sort of an introduction to the concept of the holidays. And I want to give a little story from the Mishnah to show how the rabbis read this verse that we just read. And basically, what's happening here is like this. The rabbis read this verse. These are holy occasions which you shall designate in their appointed times. So their appointed time sounds like it's got to be the right time. But the rabbis highlight the word you shall designate. In literal Hebrew, it says, Asher tikru otam. You should call them in their appointed times. Otam is them, referring to the holidays. The rabbis read this verse. Remember, in the Torah, there are no vowels. So they explain this verse and say, don't read it, otam. You will call them. You will call the holidays. Instead, read it, Asher tikru, not otam, but atem. You will decide when the holidays occur. And I'm going to tell you we're going to read inside a relatively famous story in the Mishnah. And the story happens like this, that there's a dispute between two rabbis about a certain, again, two witnesses showed up in Jerusalem and they testified and they say, we saw the new moon and this is how it looked. And there was a dispute of whether or not they should be accepted. And Rabbi Yoshua, who was a greater sage, said, I'm not accepting them. Rabbi Gamliel, who had the majority behind them, says, I am accepting them. And now we went into a big problem. There's two rabbis, and they can't figure out that what day 1 of the month is. In other words, they can't figure out even when Yom Kippur is. And Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year. And now we get to the fascinating drama that unfolded about the calendar. The Jews always have something to create a drama about, but this is a big deal. When Yom Kippur is, could you imagine? Jews today, we have what to fight. We fight about this detail, that detail, but everyone agrees when Yom Kippur is. Could you imagine two of the greatest rabbis of Israel cannot agree when Yom Kippur is? Could you imagine the crisis that would unfold? So here we go. I'm going to turn to the Mishnah and we'll read it. So the Mishnah, of course, is the first compilation of the oral law. Once in a while, they give us a story because the story has an important point to make. So here we go. This is the story. Upon hearing that Rabbi Yeshua has challenged his ruling, Rabbi Gamliel was the head of the court, sent a message to him, and he says, I decree against you that you must appear before me with your staff and with your money on the day on which Yom Kippur occurs according to your calculation. According to my calculation, that day is the 11th of Tishrei, the day after Yom Kippur. So here we have a problem. Rabbi Gamliel, who's the leader of the court, hears that there's a great rabbi, Rabbi Yeshua, who would not accept the ruling of the court, and he wants to make his own Yom Kippur one day later. So Rabbi Gamliel says, we can't have this. We can't have two Yom Kippurs in Judaism. We can't have half the community keeping one Yom Kippur and the other half keeping another Yom Kippur. So what Rabbi Gamliel says, he says, I, with the force of the law, with the force of the court, I decree that you desecrate your own Yom Kippur. He didn't say sit in your basement and do whatever you want. He says, no, you have to come with me with your walking stick and with your money. That's a desecration of Yom Kippur, and violate the Yom Kippur according to the Yom Kippur, which is the Yom Kippur according to your calculation. Now, for your Rabbi Yeshua, who's being decreed upon to violate his Yom Kippur, obviously Rabbi Yeshua was very distressed. Rabbi Akiva went and found Rabbi Yeshua distressed that the head of the great Sanhedrin was forcing him to desecrate the day that he maintained was Yom Kippur. In an attempt to console him, Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Yeshua, I can learn from a verse that everything that Rabbi Gamliel did in sanctifying the month is done, i.e. is valid. As it is stated, and this is the verse from our parsha, and that's why I'm reading it. These are the appointed seasons of the Lord, sacred convocations, which you shall proclaim in their season. The verse indicates that whether you have proclaimed them at the proper time, or whether you have declared them not at the proper time, I have only the festivals as established by the representatives of the Jewish people. So this is very powerful, and this is why I want to read it. Rabbi Akiva says, and that follows the law. The law says, even if the people are mistaken, not only if they're mistaken, even if they transgress and declare Rosh Chodesh on the wrong day, God says that's the only Rosh Chodesh. That's the new month. That's what the holidays follow. The story continues. Rabbi Yeshua then came to Rabbi Dosa ben Orkinas, who said to him, if we come to debate and question the ruling of the court of Rabbi Gamliel, we must debate and question the ruling of every court that has stood from the days of Moses until now. As it is stated, then Moses went up, and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. But why were the names of these 70 elders not specified? Rather, this comes to teach that every set of 3 judges that stands as a court over the Jewish people has the same status as the court of Moses. So this is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. What's happening here is as follows. Rabbi Akiva tells Rabbi Yeshua, you have to listen to the court, and he gives a halachic reason. He says, because that's what the verse states. The verse states that you have to follow the people even if they're mistaken. When he goes to Rabbi Dosa ben Orkinas, he gives more of a practical reason. He says you can't question the court, because if you question this court, you have to question all the courts, and then the law and order collapses. And he brings a very interesting interpretation. He says, we know that Moshe had 70 people in his court. Why don't we know who they are? Why? The Torah specifically keeps them anonymous. Because if we would know who was in Moses' court, then when I go to court, I say, these are judges. Could these people be compared to Moses' court? I'm not listening to these guys. I would only listen to Moses' court. That's why the Torah keeps the people, the members of Moses' court, anonymous, specifically in order to be able, that every person should realize that it's the power of the court. It's not a power of the individual person who's on the court. Now we'll just finish the story, even though we made our main point. Since it is not revealed who sat on that court, apparently it is enough that they were official judges in a Jewish court. When Rabbi Yeshua heard that even Rabbi Dosa ben Orkinas maintained that they must submit to Rabbi Gamliel's decision, he took his staff and his money in his hand and went to Yavne, to Rabbi Gamliel, on the day on which Yom Kippur occurred according to his own calculation. Upon seeing him, Rabbi Gamliel stood up and kissed him on his head. He said to him, "Come in peace, my teacher and my student. You are my teacher in wisdom, as Rabbi Yeshua was wiser than anyone else in his generation." So even though he didn't have the majority, he wasn't the head of the court, but he was wiser. So the head of the court who forced Rabbi Yeshua to violate Rabbi Yeshua's on Yom Kippur, he kisses him and he says, "Peace upon to you, my teacher and my student. You're my teacher in wisdom, but you're my student as you accepted my statement despite the disagreement." So why am I telling this to you? I'm telling this to you because there's a very important point here. What God is saying is, even if the people declare the holiday on the wrong day, that's still the holiday. What does that tell you about the holidays? That tells you that the whole purpose of the holidays is that the people are the ones who sanctify it. The people are the ones who say, now is the time. It's not a holy day, essentially. It's not Shabbat, which is holy regardless if we have human participation or not. But God is saying the people have the power to take a day on the calendar and say, this is a day of meeting. This is a day that we're going to have a date with God. And that is sort of the introduction to the story of the holidays. Now we could start thinking about individual holidays and what they represent. But this is introduction. Any comments, questions, please share. Otherwise, we continue. Okay. Okay, one more detail associated with what we just said. I hope we're not getting too technical here, but we mentioned, was it last week? I think last week we spoke about at great length about the dispute between the sages and the Sadducees, the people in the period of the Second Temple who rejected the oral Torah. And they said, we're only going to follow the written Torah, we're not going to follow the oral Torah. And there was a big dispute about Yom Kippur, as we discussed last week. When do you put the incense on the ashes, on the coals, and when do you create the smoke when entering the Holy of Holies? So we discussed that last week. But probably even more famous, the most famous dispute between the Sadducees and the sages was also about the holidays and about this week's Parsha. And that is, the question was, when do you celebrate Shavuot? So Shavuot is a very interesting holiday. It's coming up. The problem with Shavuot, and the reason why it makes it so interesting, is that Shavuot, that is the day that we celebrate the giving of the Torah, it does not say in the Torah, there's no date on the calendar. Every other holiday has a day of the calendar. Passover, the 15th of Nisan. Rosh Hashanah, 1st of Tishrei. Yom Kippur, 10th of Tishrei. Sukkot, the 15th of Tishrei, etc. The only day that does not have a day on the calendar is Shavuot, the holiday of weeks. Why is it called the holiday of weeks? For the same reason that it doesn't have a day of the calendar. When is Shavuot? 7 weeks after Passover. Really after the first day of Passover. 7 weeks after the first day of Passover, which is with 49 days. The 50th day is Shavuot. That's what we read in this week's Parsha. So all is fine and all is good and everything is wonderful. The problem, except that the Torah says one word that makes everything, that confuses everything. So let's see if we can find it. So let's read a little bit about it, the counting of the Omer, and then the holiday of Shavuot. What is Omer? Everyone knows that we're now counting the Omer is 49 days. It's called counting of the Omer. What does the Omer mean? So Omer is simply a measurement of barley. And what happens was that in Israel, the season of Passover is the season when the barley ripens, or the grain ripens, specifically barley, but it applies to grain as well. And a Jewish farmer, was not allowed to eat any of the new grain that grew until on the second day of Passover, they would offer an Omer offering, an offering of barley in the temple. And that represents that we acknowledge that the blessing comes from Hashem, that our produce comes from Hashem, and therefore we give the first serving of the produce, we give it to God, and only then could we eat the new produce. So that's what we're going to read about in our parsha. So again, the first verse is till verse 8 refers to Passover. After Passover, we get to the story of the counting of the Omer. So let's read it inside. The Torah. Moses could say it better than I could. Here we go. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, when you come to the land which I am giving you, and you reap its harvest, you shall bring to the Kohen an Omer of the beginning of your reaping. And he shall wave the Omer before the Lord, so that it will be acceptable for you. The Kohen shall wave it on the day after the rest day." That's a big problem. The day after the rest day, literally, day after Shabbat. Okay, so we're going to keep. Then they would bring an offering. Let's read 14. "You shall not eat bread or flour made from parched grain or fresh grain until this very day." In other words, the new grain cannot be eaten until the Omer is offered, until you bring your God sacrifice. This is an eternal statute throughout your generations in all your dwelling places. Now we get to the mitzvah to count. "And you shall count for yourselves from the morrow of the rest day, from the day you bring the Omer as a wave offering, 7 weeks, they shall be complete. You shall count until the day after the 7th week, namely the 50th day, on which you shall bring a new meal offering to the Lord." In other words, 50 days later is the holiday of Shavuot, and there you bring a new offering to the Lord. That new offering, again, is the new grain, not the new barley, but the new wheat. And that is what we call the holiday of Shavuot. How do I know it's a holiday? So far, we're just talking about grain, because if you keep reading and go to 21, "And you shall designate on this very day a holy occasion, it shall be for you. You shall not perform any work of labor. This is an eternal statute in all your dwelling places throughout your generations." So what is he saying? He's saying on the 50th day, you have to make it a holy day. You're not allowed to do any work. But what day of the month? 50 days from when you start counting. Wonderful. When do you start counting? Well, we know we start counting the second day of Passover. Why? That just makes sense. We're talking about Passover. Then we have the counting, and then you have Shavuot. The problem is, the verse says, "Usfartem lochem," you shall count for yourselves from the morrow of the Shabbat. Here they translate rest day, the day of Shabbat. So the Sadducees say, no, it's not Passover, it's Shabbat. What do they mean? So they say Shavuot only can be on Sunday. You don't start counting from the day after Passover. You start counting from the day after Shabbat, which leads to all kinds of questions of what do they think? Which Shabbat? Oh, we don't know. Okay, so I don't want to get into too much of their philosophy, but the bottom line is they believe Shavuot must be on Sunday. It must be after Shabbat, because the verse says that Shabbat is... because the verse says you start counting after Shabbat. The sages have all kinds of proofs that Shabbat doesn't mean what we call Shabbat. Shabbat means the day of rest. And Passover is also a day of rest because you can't do work. And there are many, many, many other proofs in the Talmud that we start counting the day after Shabbat. Very nice. You want to study the Talmud, it's pages and pages. Wonderful. The question here becomes, again, what's at stake? What are they arguing about? What is at the heart of their argument? Why is this argument creating all this passion? And the answer is that, again, consistent with what we have been saying, that the whole idea of the holiday is that the people determine when the holiday is. That's the holidays. If it's a day of the month, we determine when the day of the month is. Shabbat is determined by God. Now, if you're a Sadducee, you cannot tolerate that the holiday of the giving of the Torah will be determined by the human beings, because your philosophy is that we want to follow what God's words. We want God to tell us what to do. So what does the Sadducee have to say? The Sadducee has to say, when is Shavuot? It's got to be on a Sunday, the day after Shabbat. Why? Because Shabbat is determined by God. So when is the holiday? When is the holiday that celebrates the giving of the Torah? God decides. What's the tradition of Judaism? In other words, the traditional Jewish people, which believe in the oral Torah, which is basically human participation in the process of understanding and exploring the Torah. They see religion not as submitting to God, but a relationship with God. And therefore, God gives us some insight, but then he expects us to interpret and apply that insight. So us, we say, no. Who determines when the Torah is given? Who determines the holiday of the Torah is given? The people do. And if the people do, then the holiday of Shavuot is pegged to Passover, which is determined by the people. So again, all I'm trying to say in the last 32 minutes is that the concept of a holiday is actually revolutionary in the sense, philosophically speaking, if we see that what the Torah is trying to say and the way the rabbis understood it is that this is a holiness created not by God, but by the people. And by holiness, I mean meeting. This is a time where it's easier to access God because God shows up to the date. But God doesn't show up to the date that he called. That's every Shabbat. He says, you tell me when to come and I'm going to come because I want a relationship with you. And that's what the holidays are. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the introduction, the story in short. Now we have a few minutes left. We could start getting into the details of the specific holidays.
Rabbi, which holidays are determined by God that human beings don't have a say in?
Shabbat. If we all get together and say it's not practical, let's do Shabbat on Monday. Doesn't work. But let me give you a scenario. A scenario is that you're the king and you don't want, it's not, your armies are not back. You sense that your armies are not going to come back on time for Passover. You need an extra day so your armies can get home for Passover. So you pressure the high court. Don't do it. It's against the separation of powers. But if you do, you pressure the high court and you say, do me a favor. Don't declare Rosh Chodesh till the next day, to a day late. And the court should not listen to you, but they do. And they declare Rosh Chodesh, the new month, a day late. So everybody knows this is a farce. This is a scam. This is not really Rosh Chodesh. The court just declared it, but it's not really true. It's based on an error. Nevertheless, the Talmud says, that's the verse that I read, Ashetikru otam, this is the holidays that you evoke. And atem, you means even if you're mistaken, and even if you're transgressing. So ultimately, if the people control day 1 of the calendar, they control day 15 of the calendar, and that's all the holidays except for Shabbat. Shabbat, we could stand on our head. We say it's not convenient. Let's move Shabbat to Tuesday. We can't do it.
Thank you.
Rabbi, have you heard the interpretation of the waving Tenufa as being Tenupeh?
I have not, but that sounds very interesting. So Tenufa is a waving, and Elisa says that it's also it comes to the word giving mouth, and that would be consistent with what we do because we don't actually bring the Omer because there is no temple, but we do count and we verbalize the counting with our mouths. So I think that's what you're alluding to. So that's fascinating. Okay, so let's think a little bit about some of the holidays, and specifically we can focus on let's start. Let me mention, we're already on Shavuot. Let's talk about Shavuot a little bit, and then we'll go to the 7th month of the calendar, which is the month of the holidays, and we'll talk about what is the rhythm and pattern of those holidays. So why is it that Shavuot doesn't have a date? I ask you a question. Why is it that of all the holidays is a date? The holiday of the giving of the Torah, there's no date. When is the holiday of the giving of the Torah? 50 days from Passover. Why can't God give us a date? By the way, today there's a set date for Shavuot. Now that we established a calendar, there's a set date for Shavuot, the 6th of Sivan. But in biblical time, in not only biblical times, in the times of the Mishnah, in other words, for the first, I would say 1800 years of Judaism, Shavuot could either be the 5th of Sivan, the 6th of Sivan, or the 7th of Sivan. There was no set date for the holiday of the giving of the Torah. So why is that? So there are all kinds of interpretations, but one interpretation is what the Torah is signaling to us is that the holiday of the giving of the Torah is not really its own holiday. It's a continuation of Passover. So then why isn't it right after Passover? Because we need time to prepare. But it's not its own holiday. If you follow the pattern, let's say Sukkot, for example. Sukkot is 7 days and then an 8th day. Passover has 7 days, no 8th day. But the 8th day of Passover is 50 days later. So what the Torah is really signaling to you that in essence, Shavuot, the holiday of the giving of the Torah, is not an independent holiday. It's a continuation of Passover. Again, you need 49 days to prepare to get the Torah, to be worthy of receiving the Torah, but it's really a continuation to Passover. What is that really telling us? It's telling us Passover celebrates the holiday of freedom. Shavuot is the holiday that we get the Torah. What Judaism is telling us is that freedom is not a value in itself. Why do we want freedom? We want freedom, not just that we should not be in bondage. We want freedom so that we could live our life according to what is defined as spiritual freedom. In other words, now that we don't have the bondage of Egypt, now we can pursue our true desire and values, and that is the Torah. So in other words, it's not two separate themes. It's not like we like freedom and we like the Torah. What the Torah is telling us, the whole purpose of the Exodus, the whole purpose of the freedom is so that not just nobody's enslaving you. Okay, so you're not in prison. Does that mean you're free? I used to have a teacher who'd like to think of himself as a philosopher. He would ask yourself, he would say, are you alive because you're alive, or are you alive because you weren't hit by a truck? In other words, are you free because nobody put you in prison? Or are you free because you're pursuing that which you really want to pursue? In other words, your core identity. That's the definition of spiritual freedom. So what the Torah is signaling to you is Passover is not the conclusion. There's no reason. It's not the full story. Passover only becomes complete. Passover only becomes meaningful. Freedom only becomes meaningful when you fill your freedom with content, with a value, and that is the Torah. So that's about the Passover and Shavuot. Now we have a few minutes left because I have to leave a few minutes early today. I apologize for that. But let's think a little bit about the holidays of the seventh month. The seventh month is a month that you have here. It's very interesting rhythm. In the beginning, you have days of awe. You have days of introspection. You have days of even fasting. Yom Kippur's day of fasting. There's no joy, no mention of joy. And then you get to the 15th day of the month. So just 4 days after Yom Kippur, and then you get the most joyous holiday, as you will see that here it only mentions it once, but in Deuteronomy it mentions again and again that we have to rejoice. So I just opened up to Rosh Hashanah. This is again chapter 23. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, it shall be a Shabbat for you, remembrance of Hashem. The shofar blast, a remembrance of Israel through a shofar blast, a holy occasion. That is Rosh Hashanah, blow the shofar. Comes Yom Kippur. On the 10th of the 7th month, it is a day of atonement. It shall be a holy occasion. You shall afflict yourselves. No joy. V'initem, cause pain to yourselves. And then it says, again, it is a complete day of rest for you, and you shall afflict yourselves. On the 9th of the month, in the evening, from evening to evening, you shall observe your rest day. No joy. It's serious, it's remembrance, it's introspection, it's pain, it's days of awe. And then you get, all of a sudden, you get to the 5th day, and the 15th day, and here is Sukkot. It's a festival, and you are supposed to rejoice and take the 4 kinds. And it even says the word joy explicitly, if I can find it, right here. And you shall take for yourselves on the 1st day the fruit of the hadar tree, date palm fronds, a branch of a braided tree, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for a 7-day period. So we take 1 month, we pack in all the holidays, and the first half of the month is I don't know if sad is the serious, and the second half of the month is very joyous. So what is happening here? Like my father would say, instead of having all the holidays packed into 1 month, if you spread it out, remember in biblical times, there's no Hanukkah, there's no Tu B'Shvat, there's no Purim. From Sukkot until Passover, you have 6 months that you're totally dry, no holidays. So the Torah should just scatter them out every month. 1 month Rosh Hashanah, next month Yom Kippur, next month Sukkot, next month Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, and before you know it, it's almost Passover. No, we consolidate. They're all in 1 month. So what the Kabbalists are telling you is that it's really all the same theme. In other words, the awe, days of awe and days of joy are two sides of the same coin. And I'm going to try to explain through a little bit of metaphor. And it's a beautiful idea. We spoke about it on Sukkot, if you remember. We were sitting in the Sukkah and we discussed it, but it's always good to talk about it again. And that is that from the perspective of the Kabbalah, the idea of the holidays can be understood by thinking about the metaphor of a dance, but not just a dance, a circle. In Hebrew, it's very interesting. In Hebrew, there's different words for dance. The common word is rikud. The rikud is to dance, but there's a specific word in Hebrew for a circle dance. It's called machol. Machol means a circle. Machol means dancing in a circle. In the King David in the book of Psalms, Psalm, I think it's 149, I think, or 146 is one of the last five. We say it every day. Yahalelu shmo b'machol. We will praise God with a circle dance. Okay, what's a circle dance? Circle dance, people go round and round. One of the oldest forms of dance that people know about. Now, if you think about this for a second, if you try to analyze this intellectually, or if a Martian comes to Mars and sees a dance, you say, what's going on here? It's totally illogical. You're starting at one point, going round and round in circles, just getting yourself dizzy. What's the point? Okay. So Kabbalistically, the dance represents a very deep truth. The dance represents as follows. If I'm sitting next to you, okay, it's very good. We're very close, but that's not going to produce the joy of the dance. What produces the excitement of the dance is the idea that you have distance, and the distance then becomes close. So either I sit next to you on the couch, it's wonderful, it's peaceful, it's tranquil, but you're not going to get the joy of the dance. The joy of the dance has to happen specifically by going away and then coming close. And that's the full dance, and that's the full circle. And the Kabbalah loves this idea because we will see that the whole life is a dance, and every day is a dance. But we'll start dancing in a minute. But before that, let's just go back to the holidays. What is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? We come to shul, we feel like we're coming close to God, yes. But in a sense, what are we contemplating? What are we introspecting? What are we thinking about? We're thinking about the distance. We're thinking about, we say, God, we sinned. God, we separated from you. God, we separated from the person we want to be. I'm moving away from my true self. I'm moving away from the people that I love. I was insensitive. I didn't express my love, et cetera, et cetera. So what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about my distance. And that's why I bang my chest and I say, I apologize. I'm going to try to correct it, but I have to fast to try to correct it. What am I sensing? I'm sensing distance. But what's the purpose of sensing distance? And what does the sensing distance do for us? It doesn't leave us in a state of sadness, specifically like the dance. Because we sense the distance, then in the second half of the month, we say, yeah, but now that we came close again, that's so much more exciting. Because if we don't experience the distance, then we cannot appreciate the closeness. And that's the full circle. That's Sukkot. Sukkot, as everyone knows, the Kabbalists explain that sitting in the sukkah is like sitting in the embrace of God. It's a hug. So the first half of the month is the first half of the circle, where we feel that we're moving away from God. I mean, we're coming to shul, we're paying membership, we're doing the rituals, but what are we doing? What's the state of mind? The state of mind is I'm sensing the gap between myself and God. I'm sensing the gap between the person I am and the person I want to be. That's the distance. But sensing the distance, now I come to the second half of the month, and now because I'm coming closer to God, all of a sudden I'm feeling the embrace, which is amazing because in Hebrew, just one more detail here, in Hebrew, the word forgiveness and the word dance, circle dance is the same exact thing. Machol is mechila. So the same word. What does forgiveness have to do with the dance? The answer is, what is forgiveness? Forgiveness is appreciating the dance. When I forgive you, I realize that the distance that you moved away from me, or you hurt me, or you offended me, now, if you want to reestablish that relationship and achieve forgiveness, now the bond is so much deeper. Now the bond actually could sustain, the distance can overcome the distance. If it can overcome the distance, it has been deepened. So the idea of forgiveness is just like the idea of the dance. And without getting too detailed here, the Kabbalists explain that the whole life is a dance. What's the dance? The soul was close to God, sitting on the couch right next to God in tranquility. But then the soul goes away from God. It descends into this earth. When it comes into this earth, it feels it's being pushed away from Hashem. And then what happens? What does it realize? It realizes that, yes, you can go away, but when you go away, you come back with more force. And that creates more meaning and more joy for the soul and for the relationship with God. And that's the rhythm of the seventh month, is really the rhythm of all of life on this earth, the soul's journey on this earth. So every holiday, every holiday season, it's really capturing what's happening to our soul in general. And you can also add that the same is true every day for every person, every experience. Inevitably in life, I'm going to feel distant from, like I said, from either from God or from the people I love. I offended my grandmother or my child or my spouse or my colleague. I feel distance. I feel that I'm distant from my goals. I'm not living the life I want to live. I'm not living consistent with the person I want to be. So I'm distant from my true self. Now the question, what does the seventh month teach us? The seventh month teaches us it's up to us to figure out, it's up to us to determine whether we want to define it as moving away, and moving away is a tragedy, or we can understand that the moving away is part of the circle. And then what's really happening is by moving away, by experiencing the pain and experiencing the distance, now we have an opportunity to come back and close the circle. And when you close the circle, you're far better off than if you never left, because sitting on the couch is nice. But anyone who ever danced realizes that the excitement and the exuberance that is created is far deeper than the tranquility of sitting on the couch. So the idea here is it's in our hands. When we sense distance, we can ask ourselves, are we far from who we want to be? Is this a failure? Is this moving in the wrong direction? Or is this gaining momentum to close the circle? And the only person that could decide that is up to me. It's up to me to figure out if I'm moving away or if moving away is part of the circle. So this, I think, is very, very, very sweet, at least to me. So I have to go a few minutes early. I apologize. You could take a question or two for a minute or two. But the bottom line is go out and dance. Sitting on the couch is nice, but you have to dance. And the idea of a dance is, if you ever sense distance, realize that the distance is only the first half of the dance. Close the circle, and you'll be in a much better place. Better than had you not experienced the distance to begin with. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see everybody. Hope to see you soon in good health. Again, apologize for the early ending, but have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
so much.